You can just use it.
Yeah, some
Okay.
people have different.
Sure. I think I got it. Yes, I did. Now I can hear myself better. Okay. Thank you very much. One of the questions was, do you find yourself wanting to hide your bicultural identity? If so, what extent? If not, is it Iran or Persia that you refer yourself to? The answer is not anymore. I'm not hiding. And also, I am from Iran, and I'm proud of it. After this, all the talks we had today, I think we all feel the same way. Do you find yourself, this is the same thing, and the answer is, I used to have hesitation to call myself Iranian and prefer to call myself Persian, but not anymore, and I am Iranian and from an Iranian family. The other one was understanding culture as being the foundation which shapes people's thought process, social interactions, and belief system. Answer this question. Do you consider the expectations of your parents the expectations that your parents have for you as support or control? And we hear this from our children a lot, that they say, my parents are controlling. Is this a support that they try to support you and save you from what they think that is the pressure from the society and all that, or you see it as a control factor? As a child, I felt it was controlling, but not anymore. I feel it is supportive now. I feel privileged that my parents took, I'm sorry if I cannot read these handwritings well, instead love to give me guidance. So that means you're taking it as a guidance, not as a control factor. When someone asks you where you're from, what is it? Okay, again, I'm Iranian, I'm not Persian. Okay, those are all the answers to the questions that we had. Okay. You all know the panel. So I'm just going to go with but they don't say who they're asking it for, but I try to just start, and then whoever wants to answer that you do want to, contribute, please go ahead and share your thoughts. As a young Iranian American, I have found in this community and outside of this community that gossip is is big in life, or is larger than life. How should we address this issue as a community, or I don't know, as an Iranian community or within the community that we live in? Okay? I leave it to you. Go ahead, and if you have a good answer, go for it.
Should we treat these as separate questions? Would that be best?
I think they were just talking about there is a lot of gossip going on, and probably gossiping is a major factor, and how should we treat it, and how should we resolve it? I don't know, or cope with it.
I'm comfortable with addressing the first question quickly.
Sure.
I always refer to myself as Iranian, and at camp we talk about the difference between Iranian and Persian. Iranian being much more inclusive. We're very ethnically and linguistically diverse as a community, as a people, and so the term Iranian is what we really push for. And I understand the sentiments around using the term Persian. My mom did something similar as that. And even though I've lived in the South and I've lived in communities that were a little bit more challenging to be Iranian, I always refer to myself as Iranian, and I guess I get that from my parents and have it reaffirmed through my community in EM.
Okay.
Is it possible to insert a question, like a comment, little comment here, related to
To
the...
insert.
Yes. Related
I
to the,
don't know, you know,
related to the,
related.
yes.
How about if
If
you
we
do
have a
it
time.
at the end, and then you
It's so
say,
quick though.
okay, go ahead, please.
What about the language? Would you prefer Persian or Farsi? I rather Farsi, that's inclusive too. But I heard that you refer to Persian as a language. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
okay.
no,
I
that's,
had to do it.
that's fair. I think grammatically, if you're speaking in English, you use the term Persian because that's just English. It's like saying Espanol versus Spanish. But I often find myself still saying Farsi.
Excellent.
Yeah. But if I'm ever writing anything formal, I always use Persian. And I've been caught by people and called out for it.
I don't think Persian is the language. You cannot use Persian. There is no dictionary. I
That
think
is
it's
right.
Farsi.
Yeah, the language that you speak is Farsi.
In Farsi it is, but in English we refer to it as Persian.
That's
So
right.
so when I went to Emory, when I went to university and took my minor, it was in Persian, not Farsi. So academics, especially, I'm not an academic, but I work with a great deal of them on EOB's board, and they take this very seriously. I think both are fair.
Okay, I wanted to revisit the concept of identity and how a person views themselves. Number one is that I find identity not to be a rigid concept. It's flexible and it's dynamic. It's not static. So in relation to your child, you become a parent. In relation to your spouse, you become a lover. In relation to your boss, you become an employee. And there's flexibility around this. So the same way, I think, how much you play up or down your Iranian identity versus what you have picked up in this country, I think it's somewhat context specific. So if you took a linear approach to identity, you might think, well, if a person has some shift in their identity depending on situation, that makes them a chameleon. I don't quite see it that way. I feel like the situation has a lot to do with how you define yourself as a person. Now, granted that there probably is a set of core principles that you are not going to compromise, regardless of what the situation dictates. But then there are certain other things about you that they are negotiable, and that depends on the situation. Number two is that my mother's family are originally from Azerbaijan. They do not identify themselves first as Persian. Their first source of identity is Azerbaijani, and then there's a secondary identity, which is Persian. My father's side is Persian. They're from the area where the Persian Empire was formed. If you look at my dad, he looks a little bit like the reliefs on Persepolis. You know, you look at his profile, he could be one of the Persian guards. You know, a little older, of course. You know, but not everybody who comes from Iran has to identify as Persian, in my mind. That also goes into the flexibility of identity, that you can identify yourself as more than one thing. I have one half of me that originally goes from back to Baku, which is now in Republic of Azerbaijan. I have another half of me that is Persian. I consider myself an Iranian man who lives in the United States and likes a lot of things about this country. So that creates a lot of room for flexibility.
And I just wanted to follow on Malkan's point that the culture is so dynamic. Many times parents ask, well, how should we raise our kids, Persian or American? Should we just teach them to speak Farsi for 7 years? They got to learn English anyway in the community. But and what is the culture? 2 cultures, 3 cultures. It's such a dynamic, such a complex set of beliefs and roots that we have to recognize the complexity in the first place. It's not black and white. It's not Iranian or American. Malkan's kid, whose father is half from Azerbaijan, half from Iran. I'm making an example of him because I don't have a kid. In the morning, might speak Farsi with Malkan, having breakfast. Get on the bus and listens to rap music playing in the school bus and hip hop music. Get into the school and has to speak English. And then sitting next to him is a Spanish kid who's throwing out Spanish words, and he has to communicate with that. So what's his culture? Iranian, American, African American. So it's, again, we have to recognize that, we have to understand that, we have to let the kid thrive in this diverse society, with exposing them to, definitely exposing them to culture and backgrounds and clues, celebrating Nowruz, celebrating Christmas, opportunity to visit Iran, opportunity to visit Azerbaijan, opportunity to visit Spain or Mexico. I think, again, cultures, especially in this country, is very, very complex, and we have to recognize and appreciate that complexity.
I'm going to talk about the question about gossip. Question.
Sorry.
All right. So why is it that we gossip? You know, I mean, I think it really kind of goes back to the issue of Aberoo again. I mean, are we defacing, trying to keep face? Are we trying to normalize by saying, well, they did it, so in case we end up doing it, it's okay? I mean, I think we have a whole culture around why we engage in gossip. And it's a negative behavior, I understand that, but I think there's self-preserving in the form of gossiping that Iranians partake in. Should we do it? Should we not do it? I think that it's harming if we tackle someone's identity as far as their dignity and their position in social societies and deface them. That's harming. That could, it can have a lot of negative effects, not only on that person but also on us, because when we engage in such behaviors, we have a tendency to also emotionally have to pay for it. The guilt and the shame of why I partaked in such behavior comes silently later, in the comfort of our own environments. I think it's such a huge, we can have a whole conference, on gossip, just like we, how do you say gossip in Farsi? Ghaibah, right? So maybe that can be the topic of next year's conference. But I truly believe that this culture is changing as our generations are starting to grow up here. And it's because we, here in America, you're taught to, from the time I was a child and I went to school, I was taught to speak my mind. It's okay to be who I am. And like Makan explained, take space, and I have a tendency to really take a lot of space, and that's my American side that kind of kicks into my behavior. So the concept of gossip is not as relevant in my life anymore. And and I kind of start to get bored with it, because it's almost that behavior of let's hide behind something. Well, why do I need to hide if I live, what I consider to be a decent life? So I just believe that this concept is also changing within our communities as the younger Iranians are taking on some American aspects of socialization.
Yeah.
Anything about gossip? Yes.
Yeah. I think I should speak
It's
on.
a sweet subject.
Yeah, I think I should speak on behalf of. I can see younger generation folks in the room glancing at me. That unfortunately gossip is still prevalent in our generation and younger generations. I think part of it is also communication. We're not particularly good at communicating directly with each other all the time. So I know in my family, whenever there's some sort of challenge or any kind of drama, if someone's even sick, there's no direct communication about it. like everyone's kind of talking behind closed doors. By the time I find out, it's months later. I think that the way we deal with that, the way we deal with conflict, a lot of that seems to be rooted in the issue of communication. And when I am with my younger campers and the issue of gossip comes up, I also am compassionate about the fact that I think we're very familial in our relationships, and so there's concern about each other. Like if I tell you something about, X person, then maybe you can have an influence over them if we all know about it, instead of just directly dealing with them. So I think that's part of it, that's the challenge. It's not helpful. I would agree with that.
I have a question for you. Do you think gossiping is just a common issue with Iranians, or is this something that is universal?
With teenagers, all together, the entire group of teenagers, it's common. I don't think it's just Iranians.
I don't believe it. I think it's universal.
That's correct.
I mean, I don't know about all cultures, but most that I'm familiar with gossip exists. It shows itself different among different cultures.
It's human nature.
So if I may add my 2 cents to this, gossip is necessary as a means of collecting social information. So you want to survive in a society, you kind of need to know who is doing what. You gotta know it. You gotta know who's on your side, who's gonna stand up for you, who's going to actually stab you in the back if the opportunity presents itself. So I want to say that the phenomenon itself is normative. Where you probably see it accentuated is in smaller communities and tightened, closed circles. If you go to Native American reservations, that's a pretty common practice. If you are in rural areas, that's a pretty common practice. Because the opportunity is also more available. Think about being really interested in gossiping and you live in New York City. Who are you going to gossip about out of the 12 million people who live there? What do you know about them to even say things about them? So there are certain things that either enhance and promote the gossiping behavior or certain things that can curb it. Even within Iran, as you have life that becomes more industrial, it becomes more urban, you see less and less of gossip, opportunity for gossip dissipates. There's one type of gossip that is not solely for informational purpose, and the intention is to in fact harm another person. So in other words, you plant a seed and you're hoping for that seed to become a vine that circles around a person and chokes them. If that were present, I would ask myself, if a person is wondering, well, what is to be done with gossip? The question you would ask yourself is that, is this sort of a simple, lighthearted, joking around so we have a good time and bond with each other? Or the intent for this particular subject of conversation is to, in fact, trample upon somebody? That would be a question to be asked, and I think every one of us may have a different answer, but I'm sure we all have the capacity to identify the distinction between the two.
Thank you. Next question is, I'm sorry, I'm sitting down so you all can see the panel. Labeling people is very common among Iranians. How do we deal with that, with this problem that separates us rather than unify?
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, labeling is very similar to gossiping. It's a form of harmful gossiping, that you're trying to use certain names to sort of gain something out of it. And I think gossiping is related to the subject of Aberoo as a defense mechanism that Makan mentioned, that probably in some cultures is more important. And so for different reasons, some people like to gossip, like to go around and talk about that person and make up some stuff, some facts and some lies, and then harm that person. And there might be an unconscious gain from this, feeling better out of this conversation. And our sensitivity towards gossiping is probably maybe our anxiety towards losing Aberoo this way. And so we're trying to sort of like keep our Aberoo, keep our face with staying away from these people that we identify as gossiping. So labeling is a similar thing, is that unfairly someone give a label to another person for a certain purpose. And I personally think really the best approach is to ignore. And this is coming from working with children. Any negative behavior, if they don't necessarily directly harm you, if you ignore them, the behavior dissipates. Or if you stay away from that person, you're basically protecting yourself. Ignorance, I believe, is the best approach towards that. And hopefully those people learn their lesson somehow, somewhere, that's not the right way to treat other people and change their behavior.
Can I just have a second to elaborate, because I made that question. I think it's very different from gossiping. Gossiping is talking behind a person, but labeling is directly in front of a person. So, just
What is the example?
like when you see somebody has a scarf, you think that that person is pro-Islamic Republic, or when somebody says something about fairness and justice, you think you put a label of leftist or socialist, something like
Do you say
that.
that in their face, or do you go and talk to your
No,
friends?
yeah, I mean, labeling is not usually done behind a person. It might be done both, but they can say it in front of you. But in gossiping, you have a fear of telling in front of a person, so you talk behind that person.
Maybe it's judgmental.
Or generalizing?
Or stereotype.
Stereotyping is the
Yeah.
word.
I think it's, to respond to that, I think it's a human tendency to want to label because you want to categorize, generalize, and simplify as much as possible. I think it's problematic in the examples you pointed out because the underlying issue is hate within our community and intolerance and suspicion and paranoia, whether it has to do with seeing someone who's from a religious community and then assuming their political beliefs or homophobia, all sorts of issues that come up in our community. I think the important thing is to talk about those issues, have conversations about them, acknowledge that they're an issue in our community. We're not the only community, but they are an issue in our community, and that's something we can recognize and move forward. A lot of times we don't want to. It's interesting, I've seen with the younger generation that the issue around politics and is not the same. I know children who are from families that politically during the revolution were completely on opposite ends of the spectrum, and their children have no idea and are friends and are very open about their family history in a way that even my generation's not comfortable. So I think it's important to be able to address that, and then I think in one of the slides you talked about relationship building. I think that's part of it too.
Mentioned, brief comments. I appreciate that. I've just expressed my opinion. I guess it's easy escape, labeling, and it's a cut and run. So once you don't want to just by labeling someone for something, you just put it out there, cut and run. That's my feeling
I
about it.
wanted to make a comment about gossiping, if you're allowed. Or should I wait for the end?
Go ahead, please. I think at this point.
The way I feel about gossiping, I think it's a learned behavior. It's more prevalent in some cultures than the other. It's a negative behavior. And it's basically short-term gain and long-term loss. Because in short term, we feel good about what we say because we're right, because the third person that we're talking about them, they're not present to defend themselves. And the best way not to be part of it is just not to contribute to gossiping. Because it's good to know that, this is a famous statement, if they can do it with you, they will do it to you. So I personally don't think gossiping is the right thing, and if you want to make it less and less and less, just not be part of it.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comment. There's a question here. It says, how do you distinguish between personal morale values and family values, and how a person's value and in how is that related and implications to Aberoo?
Family or family?
Family.
Oh, family. I apologize, I missed the question. because
It's
I got
actually,
caught up in a
it's
in a
kind
word.
of, vague the way it's written. It says, how do you distinguish between personal values and family values? And the Aberoo in quotation and implications. of Aberoo to personal and family values. So probably it means like there are some personal values that we have, and there are family values that has been imposed on us. And how are those related to Aberoo? Okay. We go back to the concept of Aberoo.
When I define the word value, I am digging into some systems of belief systems and where these come from, again, actually come from our families, come from the roots that shaped us. So those are the systems that create my personal values. Now, living in a bicultural society as an immigrant and I actually identify as an American Iranian. And I explain this a little bit later. I have, I think at times people would have stoned me to death if I identified this way, but I've kept it. And the reason I identify that way, and I'll get back to this as well because that's a personal value that I have, is because when I am presented with a situation in life, my initial response is with my American values, the values that I have been shaped with living in this country. So then I, fall back on my Iranian values to see if my behavior will be okay in that culture as well. So for that reason, I identify as an American Iranian. So certainly my Iranianness is very, very important to me. And knowing that my thought process is American is also important to me because that brings a certain sense of awareness. So personal values. I have a lot of values, and I think most of us here can identify with this, that as I have aged, I've realized that these values that I grew up with are important, and I certainly practice them. So there's, I think with value systems and Aberoo, there's a sense of self-identity, learning who we are, and really becoming comfortable with our practices in life that identifies, personal value versus family values. And, and for us women, we always say, oh gosh, I did that. I swore I would never behave like my mother, right? That statement is a value statement, right? Those were her values. She behaved that way. I hated it when she did it. And today, I turn around and do the exact same thing. So, it comes from our core. It comes from those belief systems that we hold very near and dear, and the importance of it in our, everyday life, which, essentially becomes our actions in life. So this concept of personal versus family values, in my opinion, our personal values come from our family values, and then we tweak it a bit once once our environment starts to grow, as we educate ourselves, as we move into environments and systems of our work, and as we create our own families, so they change a little bit.
There's a term in psychology, modern psychology, separation individuation, and that has different steps and stages. A baby is born, it's with mom is feeding the baby, they are almost one. The next step, the baby is able to move around, so separates from the mom, understands the environment. The next step is when the toddler is 2 years old. Now he's able to start kind of walking and checking around, checking mom, where she's checking, keeping an eye on me or not, and individuating from mom one more step and separating. A few years later, steps into the society, going to the first year of the school as a 6 years old, 7 years old, if it's traditional Iranian, but nowadays they go at 2-3 years old, they go to pre-K and all that. But they step into the society, and now they kind of look around and learn about, wow, there are other people other than my family of origin, and another step of separation and individuation happens. Years later, if someone immigrates to a new country, moves to a new country, some analysts call this another step of separation and individuation, separating from country of origin and getting into a new country and trying to understand that country and their values. So value changes step by step through all these stages of development and through these steps of separation and individuation. And I think as an adult, personal value and family value, I don't see any specific difference between these two. They become that person's individual value, although it came from the family of origin, came from the country of origin, came from the new country that they stepped into, came from people that they got to know, trainings and learnings and education that they received, and experiences that life brings to everyone, and it's very unique to everyone. And so, again, by adulthood, we expect someone to be able to have his own values and form his own values after separating and individuating, hopefully in a healthy way, through these steps and through these years.
Value, he or she is talking about, with regard to family values, the values that the family has, but I haven't accepted it. But when the part of the family values that you have accepted it, whether indoctrinated or deliberately or whatever, then they become your personal value. So your personal values, part of it is indoctrinated by parents. Part of it you have deliberately chosen it by any standard. But if you are differentiating and saying that these values are my family's, so they are the values that you haven't accepted it, but you are going by them. I mean, you.
If I may respond to that, not necessarily. Of course, humans we're gifted with intelligence and language, right? So certainly my parents' generation have certain values that are not relevant to the contemporary. I always talk about the contemporary life, and what I mean by that is that the life that I live today. I don't have children, but a personal value to me, if I did have children, is that how much TV or technology they would get to use. That was not relevant to my parents' generation when they were raising me. I had 2 hours of TV time, and depending on اگه آبروی پدر مادرم اون روز برده بودم یا نه, I got to watch it or not, right? I mean, if you think about it, it was just not really relevant. But in today's modern society, right, and that was a value system that maybe dated and whole at the time. So I think value systems also change based on the evolution of humans changing and becoming contemporary, living in the world today versus living in the world 50 years ago, vicariously trying to live with values of 50 years ago. So sometimes I think letting go of some of our value systems is not necessarily, in my opinion, in disagreement with our family's value system. It is just that certainly they're not relevant in today's modern life, as I practice life, or as I choose to live life.
Thank you. I have a question here that it says question for Mona. And that says, where are the camps held?
The location changes every year. It's a national program. So in the past, we've done it in Boston, we've done it in Western Massachusetts, Hemlock in Virginia, Atlanta, we've done it, and then Southern California and Northern California. If you want to know about this year's location, we'll be releasing it on our website in the coming months. It's likely to be on the West Coast, and the reason being the weather is much better in the summer than it is on the East Coast.
We'll order it to be better here.
If you control the humidity is number one and the rain number two, I'll change it for you. It's in July, so the humidity is a real issue on the East Coast.
Okay, and question number 2 is for Dr. Habibpour, which the question is, what does a healthy, functioning value system is?
Sure, I can answer that.
And also, it seems like you're supposed to be visualizing it because it says, how does it look like?
Peaches and cream.
Again, follow up on the previous question also, value and culture is, I hope, I wish I could visualize it, but it's a very dynamic, very shapeless concept. I came here 8 years ago and visited last summer Iran after 7 years. I didn't go back for 7 years. So I was speaking fluently Farsi when I came here. I passed concours. I answered 100% my Farsi questions. Came here and learned English, followed up on what I knew about English, learned about the culture, going to trainings and residency and working with patients and all that. But when I went back last summer, I felt like I don't belong to that society anymore. My Farsi speaking has changed. They could pick on it. The value system was totally different. I got into almost an argument with cab driver over taarruf. Come on, you're killing my time. How much is it? It's like mehmun ma bashid. I forgot about that. And so when I was flying back, I realized I don't belong to that society anymore. And I don't fully feel that I belong to this society either, because I lived in this country for 25 years. So what are my value system? What is my culture? What's my language? I can't speak English fluently. I have misspelling, mispronunciations here. Farsi nowadays, someone in a party 2 weeks ago, an Iranian 70-year-old said, "You speak Farsi like you just moved here, you were born here." And it was almost an insult to me. So you know, if you can tell me with this story what's my value system or culture, I appreciate that. But I've been to therapy, but for myself, I've no basics of psychology, and it's such a mixture and such a dynamic situation that it changes every single day. So what I did yesterday, I might not approve anymore, and that my value might change. I think, bottom line, we all need to learn that as Samar mentioned very well, things change every single day, and we have to be open to change our thinking and moral system and value system every single day, and be able to talk about it in a neutral, mutually respectful environment, not to gossip around, be able to talk about the feelings, be able to talk about things, and learn and step forward from that. More than trying to define a frame, trying to define a shape of what is the value system here, what is healthy, what is not healthy, and then try to pursue that and kind of take that as a role model, because I personally don't think there's such a thing. Correct me.
That's healthy.
I would like to.
It's going to be borrowed from your country of origin, and it's going to be borrowed from what you learned in this country. So in other words, it's going to look haphazard and incoherent. A good thinker, in my opinion, has the responsibility to themselves to verbalize what the values are. So for instance, if I value family, I need to be clear about that. And that needs to inform what I do in my life, how I structure my day, how much time I spend with my family. In other words, I can't pay lip service and say, well, family is important to me, but then in reality, what I do is spend almost all of my day without them. So what I want to emphasize is that if you do not intervene in crafting your own value system, one is going to be created for you. If you want to be a part of it, you have to be active. You have to ask yourself questions. Like what Samar said, you ask yourself a question as well, this used to be a value a decade ago. Is this still relevant? Do I still want this as part of who I am? And this is an ongoing process.
I was going to add something to that, if you don't mind me. What we're talking a lot today is about being Iranian and identifying as this and that. And I think we are omitting a fact that we are part of human culture. I think if we realize that we are from human culture and stop our ego and that man zehni that is constantly telling us how we are separated from other people, maybe we can then generations and people and cultures and communities can come together and stop this, you are Iranian and I'm American, oh by the way I'm Iranian American, now American Iranian. All of that is what's the conversation that's going in our head, and it's trying to separate us from what is really important for all of us, which is becoming that one that
the one source that we all are from. And I think if we all can concentrate on that, and we really realize that none of these conversations would be relevant anymore, and we realize that we all have one value, and the value of love and being happy and being
Excellent.
together. That's all that matters.
Excellent.
And everything else then would just come into place.
I respectfully disagree with that statement. I feel like we do have, the same way as a race, we all have, most of us have 2 eyes, most of us have hair, you know, not myself, but most of us have 2 arms, so there's certain things that identify and label us as human. Does it mean that the 2 of us sitting next to each other look like each other? The answer is no. So I think if a person wants to be realistic and capture essentially everything that's in reality, you identify both the similarities and the differences, and minimizing one at the expense of the other would distance you from reality.
No, I didn't mean to, we all are the same. I meant that you keep your individuality, but with the understanding that we all belong to human race. You know, it's okay for me to be Iranian, and I still am Iranian, and I'm very happy about it, and I'm proud because I have certain values and certain way of being, which I enjoy being, and I portray myself in the outside world. But underneath it all, if we realize that we all are from the same source, I think a lot of all this chatter will go away. I agree with you, but it's just in a little bit different way. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, after this, whatever comments you have, reach out later on when we, go outside for refreshments and all that. I have a couple of more questions. One is, why Iranians cannot work together, why they're individually very strong, together they're very weak.
The person who raised that question works with Iranians?
Okay. The other question is there anybody who, because I think you answered something.
This question is not a very simple question in my opinion. Most of our migration did not happen because we wanted it to happen. I mean, this is a very deeply rooted question, and again, coming here, if Iranians want to do, initially, starting about maybe 35 years ago, since the revolution, and when migration started to happen, and at the mass that they started to happen, most of us who did not choose to come left everything behind and came. And those are assets, as Dr. Malkan talked about earlier. My dad had a whole lifetime of work and assets and money that we had to leave behind to leave. So imagine that, and then you come to a host country and you are very happy that you're here because, being one of the lucky ones that I got to migrate with my family and the whole unit of my family. And this talk of conversation actually came up in my house not too many nights ago at a dinner, and it was how, it was the imprisonment and then how they took everything, and I thought, is that really important? I mean, what's important is my dad's sitting on the chair next to me right now, and I have the opportunity to, have this moment with him. So why is it that Iranians can't work together? It's because of that whole issue of Aberoo. This man, and there's not a difference between my father or many people who shared my walk, right? As far as the historic events happening. You leave everything behind, you leave a hero, you become a zero. How do you share that? How do you show that face to other people? And we did not talk about it. We did not talk about it. And so within this silence of our community, the silence that, I think happened naturally in our communities to forget the past, the painful past of having to leave our land, having to leave our sick mothers and brothers and sisters behind and migrate to a better life, right? Silence happened, and that silence, in my opinion, is what kept us away from each other. So can we work together? In fact, we can. When I started practicing here, I started to look for professionals in my field that I could, refer to. because it's important. It's not that, you know, why wouldn't I be able to work with an Iranian? In fact, I can and I will, and you know, and I make a conscious effort to do so. So I think it's also a mentality that we've created, you know, that kind of ایرانی اینجا می‌بینی از اون ور 2 تا پا داری 2 تا دیگه قرض بگیر بدو برو, you know, and we don't have to do that anymore. We've come a long way, and we can change this. Our generations can start to change this phenomenon.
Okay, so in my opinion, there is actually some legitimacy to that statement, and there's historical reasons for it, even though I agree that it's not quite as it used to be. So over time, it has dissipated some. My perspective on the question is that when if you want to have full cooperation between a number of individuals, you need to have a system in place. Think about an all-star soccer team, that you essentially collect different athletes from different teams and you put them together, and then what are the results usually? Terrible. They're terrible. So if you have like the best soccer stars from all around the world, you put them in one team and they don't practice together, they perform terribly. That's because there is no system in place. There has to be a person who is designated midfielder, has to be a person who is designated forward, backward, all of these things. So require a system for individuals to work with each other. Systems require consistency, and they require contiguity. And this is what's been missing in our history. We did not have consistency. With every few decades, we've had a new king, we've had a new government, a new governor, so things have not been consistent. We have never had the opportunity historically to develop consistency and having coherent systems in place. Therefore, we have not practiced this. I feel like given the right circumstances and practice, us, like any other group of people, we can cooperate beautifully with one another. But that's there. I think, in my mind, it exists. We can identify it and we can find ways to get around it.
I agree. Playing off of the soccer example, I mean, the reason we never win at the World Cup too is we have a team made up of really great individual players who don't play as a team. They're not team players. I think one thing that's interesting for me, even just in looking at my family and working with Iranians and then Iranian Americans, is that in the American school system, we constantly are in group projects. When I was little, I was one of the most obnoxious people in the group because it was all about my ego. And through years of working with other people, it's been conditioned so that I can work in a group. I think that's really important. I think that's a distinction between the Iranian school system and American school system. I also think that it's historical. There's also, I mean, we went through a huge trauma as a community. We're only 30 so many years after this revolution. It's the same thing as labeling, suspicion, paranoia that we have about each other. And so we're more willing to work with people outside of our community than we are in our community because of that as well.
Wonderful. Great answers, really. I totally agree.
Just representative of the younger generation, and I hope those of you who are part of that generation are okay with it. We do. I mean, going through the American school system from kindergarten on, you do group projects all the way through university. It's constantly working in groups. And you have that struggle, you know, where one person wants to be the leader and doesn't end up being the leader all the time or ends up being really poor leader. So
there is a hope for in the future Iranian work with each other.
We work with each other. I mean, half the people in the room, but it's not just my generation. ESSR and all of its volunteers work together to organize this conference. These three obviously know each other. You've worked together, I would assume.
But we're still butt heads. Yes, please.
Thank you all for your time and expertise. I just wanted to ask a quick question from all of you at any stage. Basically, as a young Iranian American woman, I'm wondering two things. First, in the workplace, how do I manage my cultural identity, whether it's Taruf or Aberoo or whatever, those elements of my identity that I love and respect, that I've learned from my family and my friends and my family friends. And how do I manage that and still maintain this kind of lean-in process that we've been talking about as a generation? And secondly, as an Iranian American woman, how I know oftentimes there's pressure for women to be kind of the cultural tie in a family, and often negotiating how to preserve our culture onto the next generation. How do we kind of bring in the men of our generation into that discussion and their role in that, and also figure out a way for us to be participants? Thank you.
Very good questions, Bonnie.
I can try to tackle the first question you asked about how do you identify as an Iranian American professional in the workplace. That's tough. That's tough, certainly, like with Obama and, you know, the Hossein and Hassan situation, shaking hands, and, you know, it's like, what am I gonna hear when I walk into the office upstairs, you know, in room 252, and someone's gonna make a comment about it? Well, I mean, if I'm an American Iranian professional, that part of my identity really doesn't, at least in my work, does not have much to do with what I've learned in school and what the institution that I work for has taught me and how I perform what they want me to perform for them. So normally, you know, I'm normally faced with two things. One is that somebody's trying to apologize to me for who I am, being Iranian, right? And two, someone's being aggressive about it. I'm not interested in your apology because, in fact, I'm very proud of who I am, and, you know, and I do speak Farsi on the phone when I do speak to Farsi-speaking people at my desk. And two, if you're being aggressive about it, then you have your own issues and go deal with them. I have learned that if I mean, I can't get any more Iranian. My last name is Tehrani, right? I mean, it's like trying to clear security, you know, at an airport with my last name, right? So, I mean, I can't really escape it. So there's no escaping it. What it is that my individuality as far as my race, my family ties, my home where I have been raised has, in my opinion, has to be clarified, right? Iran is not my home. Colorado, in fact, is my home, right? So when somebody says, when was the last time you went home? I say, oh, a few months ago. And they're like, really, it was a long trip. Not really, it was 5 hours, right? So I actually tackled the issue toe to toe in a sense that understand that my individuality is not, as far as my work is concerned, does not tie into this Iranian-ness of me, right? That's just part of the whole pie of who I am as an individual, right? So where does the accent come from? Certainly it's an Iranian, Coloradan, Western, Eastern. I mean, it's so mixed now as I have moved up and around that, you know, I can't even identify necessarily exactly what accent it is, right? So it's not an Iranian accent necessarily, right? So I think if you identify who you are for yourself, if you clarify that for yourself, then, you know, once you get into this dispute, then it's easy to tackle the questions, and it's easy to understand who you're going to go toe-to-toe with and who you're going to, you know, give them the yellow pass card and say, you know, you go deal with it on your own.
I want to add something to that. A separate aspect of what you mentioned about navigating in the workplace, right? So I can admit that as an Iranian American, I've been held back in the professional arena for Tarov and for some of the cultural aspects like humility. That's a huge one in my family. That's something that I've been held back within the American setting professionally. And so what I've learned is like you have to know how to boast. You have to be able to celebrate your successes. That's not something I was taught to do. That I was taught to be humble about it and always deny that I was good at something, deny that I was successful at something. On the converse side, I've also lost when it's come with other Iranians. And the reason being, as an Iranian American, I have a very specific view of what Tarov is. Up until now, I've always understood as Tarov being me denying something I want for someone else, me being really polite, me being really friendly, supportive of other people, you know, oh no, I really don't want this. Or with my American friends, like, no, I'll pay for it. And then constantly being the one to pay for it. With Iranians, I've also learned that when you are in Iranian society, you learn both sides of Taruf. You learn how to use Taruf when it's polite and when it's very friendly and it's when it's showing that you have good manners. You also know how to do it when it's really clever, like khiri zarangi. Like, there is a way to use Taruf that I do not understand, and I've only heard about, that is a very clever side of it. So when you don't do it, it doesn't mean you're less Iranian. Sometimes I'm like, if I'm not as humble as I should be, then I'm somehow denying it and becoming more Amerikai, right? It's not necessarily true. We didn't learn the advantageous side of Taruf, and there is one. So I think you have to learn how to boast. You have to learn how to talk about things that you do really well.
I'm glad you didn't learn it.
I've been called Sadiq, and you know what? I appreciate it, and I think I feel good about it. But there's a side that we don't know about, Pawni.
Okay, and this is the last question I'm posing, and that is like, what do we even have to teach our children to speak Farsi? The other one is it okay to celebrate Christmas, or we shouldn't? We just celebrate Nowruz. There are family members and, you know, people that I know, they choose to just celebrate Hanukkah and not to go all over the place and confuse their children. That's my, you know, take on that.
I think you should answer it since you're maybe the only one with a baby up here.
Well, typically what research shows is that when you have an ethnic or linguistic group that relocates to a new location, generally, and this is really ballpark estimate, that the generation that comes right afterwards knows the language, has a functional ability of using the language. The one that comes after is the one that is sort of at the risk of losing the language. I've certainly seen that within my own family with the languages that they spoke and the countries that they came from. For me, the rule of thumb is the third generation generally tends to not be great at the language that the ancestors spoke. You may know some curse words, you may know some little things here and there about the language, but not quite a whole lot more. The value that I see in language is as not just the language itself, is this as a vehicle for identity and culture. If you speak a language, if you know how it feels to use the word like Aberoo or Ta'aruf, then it's not just the words that you know. You know social context. You have an affective state, an emotional state that's connected to that word. You have a lot of things that enrich you as a person. This would be sort of my spiel for why I think it's not just a functional spoken ability of language. I would basically probably advocate for all four linguistic skills: listening, speaking, writing, and reading. All four of them, in my mind, that's how I identify a person knowing the language. Just the fact that I know some Azerbaijani words and I can carry a rudimentary conversation in it, it doesn't make me a speaker of that language. That's number one. Number two is that this is not a personal opinion of mine. Folks who have done a lot of research on trauma and dislocation all have a consensus that rituals are important in maintaining continuity of a family's life cycle. It's important specifically after a family emigrates. So whatever rituals existed in the family before, it probably is going to be useful for the family to keep them. If you want to incorporate some new ones that you learned in this culture and you find them as a good fit for your family, then by all means welcome. What we do in our family is we actually we do have a Christmas tree up, we do decorations, we do all of those things. We also celebrate Nowruz. So I don't see as one or the other. I see it more inclusive as opposed to exclusive.
I do want to say something about language. I just want to say, as a community, we have to be very sensitive with the topic of language. It's something that's very loaded, particularly for younger Iranian Americans. It's been an issue that has either said, you know Farsi, you must be more Iranian, you don't know it, you're less Iranian, you don't speak it well, what did your parents do, it's really loaded, and it does become a label. I think Another thing about language is when you teach it at a much younger age, it's a lot easier to learn. And it's something that if you don't, it's hard, right? I've seen a lot of parents where their Farsi is wonderful and their English is just abysmal, and they'll still refuse to speak in Farsi because they're practicing their English with their kid. It's going to help their kid assimilate. Your kid will learn. I learned English in school. I went in and I spent the first year being in ESL. They'll learn the language really quickly. What they won't get is the Farsi. And when you do give them the Farsi, you are connecting them to their grandparents. My mother has a much easier time talking in Farsi than in English, and my nieces and nephews who don't speak it don't get the full value of having her as a grandparent. It means you're able to navigate spaces more in our community. It gives you, also there's a lot of research that if you speak another language, you'll do better academically. Parents love hearing that. You'll do better academically if you know another language. Great incentive for learning it. And if your child doesn't know Farsi, or there are young people in your family who don't know Farsi as well or have an accent, to be really sensitive of that. They didn't live there. My mom has more of an accent in English than I do in Farsi, and she'll say that, it's great that you lived outside of the country and still know Farsi. But a lot of times, even within their same age group, they're denied their culture and identity because of their language. So it is, language shaming is something that I was speaking to Ponta earlier, and she mentioned language shaming is big in our community. There are wonderful spaces like Iran Cultural Education Center that do an incredible job. All of my campers that come from that school speak Farsi better than me. And my mom was an educator in Farsi, so it's embarrassing. What they do really well is they build a community space. So the parents interact, the kids interact, they are involved in extracurriculars. It's a wonderful space that they are a part of. It's also a space where the parents realize that they can't send their kid 1 hour a week and expect them to learn Farsi. That's something that they have to do at home with them too. So be really sensitive, particularly for us Iranian Americans, be really sensitive of what language means.
All right. I would like to really thank you for being here, spending your Sunday with us, and answering all the questions. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been a great asset.
We also have evaluation forms. I think you took some as you were registering, but if you haven't, it's right there. Please let us know how this was so we can plan other events like this. And Ms. Chamanaro has something for our guests. And I have to tell you, she stood in long lines to have them signed by the author.
We tried to get you something. We thought about it. We couldn't find anything to deserve it. So a few weeks ago, I read this book from Khaled Hosseini. And it's his last book. I mean, not last book, but a recent book. And that's the only book of his which shows a little bit culture gap. And I told my people from ESSR, how about I ask Khaled Hosseini to sign it for our speaker? And we went there with Gela Rejun and we spent a lot of time.
More than 6 hours.
Yes. It's nothing, but really shows how we love you. From, I hope you like it. Yes, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed us. I did. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's nothing, but I hope you
Yeah. And thank you very much for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing more from you, what kind of things you'd like to hear our community talk about, and we'll be at your service. Contact us.
And I have it for Gela Rejun for
Thank you.
very, she did a lot. Thank you very much.
Also to
Unfortunately,
remind,
these are not signed. We didn't sign for everybody. Sorry about that.
and also to remind you about the Iran Cultural and Educational Center 25th Anniversary Conference and Gala on next Saturday the 12th, October